I'm happy to see so many out today.
Man.
Taking part in celebrating Martin Luther King's birthday. It meant so much for the world. Just to live in peace, love one another. I'm honored and yet I'm humbled today to introduce a profound preacher and speaker. Reverend Burton was the pastor there at Sweet Union Missionary Baptist Church in Virginia. And now he is the pastor emeritus. I've been knowing this man down through some years. I have learned a lot from him. I ask you today to sit with your tent door open and listen to this man who is full of wisdom and knowledge. As he comes, will you receive him with a heart and hand clap? God bless you. Reverend Burton.
And now to the presiding officer, Coach Beal, to the ladies who so helped us in a marvelous way to realize what is going on. This is Kovac and Whittier, and to Reverend Crump, whom I thank for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here and for the introduction. I want to start by saying something about, not about King, but a man by the name of Whittle. I know that you never heard of Whittle. If you say you did hear of him, I know you're not telling the truth because I made up the name myself. But Whittle was somebody who had an apple orchard. And as the story goes, he not only raised apples, but he was good at profanity. Most of you don't know what that word is. Or profanity, or in plain language, he used a lot of curse words. So one day, as the story goes, Whittle gathered his apples and he had a wagon, and when he got halfway up the hillside, the tailgate fell out of the wagon. And he was so known for the profanity that he used that the neighbors began to gather around because he was good at using profanity, and they wanted to know what new curse words he was going to use that day. And when they gathered around with his apples on the ground, and they looked at him to hear what he was going to say. And I want to tell you, I want to quote his own words, what he said on that day. He said, "I ain't got no words to describe it." And I sort of feel like the Whittle did then. I really have not at my disposal any words to express the appreciation for what has gone on in Floyd and for what the people here have done to bring us into the kind of world that we ought to be in. I wish I could describe it, but I have not at my disposal words to express my appreciation. You ought to give yourself a pat on the back and bless you. Let me say that you probably will not hear a lot about what is going on, and the reason for that is because it's good. if somebody had shot somebody, it would have been on the national news. It looks like all the good news gets spread abroad. And those things that are happening that are good, people keep to themselves. And so it is that way. But nevertheless, I think the people here ought to be proud and thankful and feel blessed at what is going on and what is going on and what is yet to come. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here to say something and commend you for celebrating the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. I put King in a certain category. All of us who have studied history know about George Washington. And we salute George Washington for he and his Continental Army led the people in the colonies to fight for their freedom. Then came another leader in our country, Abraham Lincoln, who led the people in such a way as to save the Union when a part of the Union was thinking about splitting away. And then the third leader that I put on the same basis was Martin Luther King, who led our people in this country to live out the true meaning of the Greek. Washington, Lincoln, and King. That's where I put King. Right. I like to not preach a sermon, although I'm retired and I'd welcome an opportunity to do so. But I do want to read some words from the New Testament in our Bibles, and I use the King James Version. Let me read these words from the Gospel of Luke. Now, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, tetrarch of Assyria, and the regions of Trapesia and Lycia, as the tetrarch of Abilene, and Annas and Caiaphas being the high priest, the word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. And he came into all the country about the Jordan, preaching the baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. And as it is written in the book of Isaiah, as the prophet said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And every valley shall be filled, and every mountain hill shall be brought low. On the crooked ways shall be made straight, and the rough ways shall be made smooth. Thus endeth the reading of these words. The reason I wanted to read from the scriptures because they say something. Let me go back and look at what we have read, and I would say that this kind in the New Testament parallels what is going on in this country by way of history. Let me go back and look at it. Note the time of history, just before Jesus came on earth in the flesh. The forerunner of Jesus was a man by the name of John the Baptist. And he preached in the wilderness. Why was that like now? Look, go back and look at what we have just read. Tiberius Caesar was the head of the government at Rome, and Rome ruled the world. Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea. Herod, the tetrarch of Galilee, the ruler there. and his brother Philip, tetrarch of Azariah. And so on, Caiaphas was the high priest. And that describes what went on in that day and time. How does that compare with what I'm talking about? Well, let me take the first century that I have described and go back and compare it with the 60s. In the 60s, in my early days in Southwest Virginia, and I was around in those days. I may not look that old, but I am. And I thank the Lord that he has given me a long life. But just as Caesar was emperor of Rome, Dwight D. Eisenhower was president in Washington. Just as Pilate was governor of Judea, John Patterson was governor in Alabama. Just as Herod and Philip were tetrarchs in their area, governors in their areas, and so we had sectional governors in the United States. Byrd in Virginia, Billboard in Mississippi, and Forbes in Arkansas. You may not recognize these names, but if you read the history a little bit, these people were in power. It was a time when America was like a wilderness. The lynchings went on. The KKK was rampant havoc. The 4 girls in a church in Montgomery lost their lives. And people like Viola LaRusso, a civil rights worker, was killed. Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi. And Medgar Evers was gunned down in his own. Now, let me say that not only was it like that, I marvel at how far we have come. We lived in a different world. When I first registered to vote there in Richmond, I did not have a form to fill out. I registered to vote on what they had was blank paper voted, piece of paper, and that's all it was. And you had to memorize what was supposed to go on that paper. And so somebody had taught me, and I remembered my name and my age, my place of birth, my social security, and all of that, and I put it down. And after I put it down, I showed the registrar my receipt where I had paid my poll tax. Now, they send registration forms around, and you don't have to pay any poll tax. I'm going back to where we have been, and somebody ought to rejoice and say we have come a long way. And I know we talk about we have a way to go, but we also be thankful of where we are now. To be able to be in this school that I'm sure back in the 60s was built with a different clientele in mind. But today, we'll be able to gather all together, not as one race or another, but all of us as God's people, created in the image of God, and sit here and celebrate together. Somebody ought to get happy. Somebody ought to express that we have certainly been blessed.
Yes.
Well, let me go on. As we look at King had a heritage. Zacharias was a priest. And John the Baptist came from that heritage. John was the son of a priest. And if you read the story of King's life, it was King who had come from a heritage. He was not just Martin Luther King he was Martin Luther King Jr., which meant that if you're going to have a Martin Luther King Jr., you have to have a Martin Luther King Sr. And so it is that he was who he was because of the heritage that he had, where he had come from. And this ought to be a lesson for those of us who are coming on now. There are people who will be something because they are following in our footsteps. Amen. I want to tell you a little story about a man who came into the classroom in Roanoke, and they had some young people there sitting around, and he said, "I want to ask you a question." So he said, "The first question I want to ask you is about the traffic lights." He said, "Well, some of you young people, tell me what the traffic light is for." The red light. A bunch of people raised their hand. "We know." And he pointed to one little girl and said, "What is the red light for?" And she said, "It's stop." He said, "Yeah, that's right. You got it right. That's what the red light is for." Then he said, "I want to ask you a second question. What is the green light for?" And again, they raised their hands. And he pointed to one little boy. And he said, "What does the green light mean?" And he said, "That means go." He said, "You got both questions right. Now I want to ask you a third question. What is the yellow light for?" And again, they raised their hands and they pointed to a little boy over there and said, "What is the yellow light for?" And the boy said, "That means beat the light." I wonder, do you see what I'm really trying to say? And that is that boy learned his lesson from what he had seen his parents do. And so it is that those of us who are here today, we are responsible to lead somebody in the right direction. Amen. And sometimes they may come up with a whole matter of beating the light because they have seen us do so. I want to be an example so that if somebody follows me, they will go in the right direction. Well, King had a heritage. I hear people talking about who is my role model, and some people will talk about some great football star. Some people will talk about the President of the United States. Some people will talk about some other outstanding person in the United Nations. But I want to tell you who my role model is. My role model was my father. He didn't have a whole lot of education. He didn't have a whole lot of finesse. He didn't have a whole lot of things that other people had. But he had a job. He worked and supported his family. And I am who I am today. And I say that I stand higher than my father. But I remember that I stand higher than my father because I'm standing on his shoulders. It is the heritage that King had that we ought to give credit to, as well as what others did. And there are people who will come on tomorrow, and tomorrow's tomorrow. And we ought to be a part of their heritage. Let me move on and say something about King's background so far as a minority people is concerned.